Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city, the City of Five Flags. And in these episodes, we're telling the story of how Pensacola itself related to the Spanish-American War of 1898. Pensacola is logically a part of that war because Cuba, where of course was the heart of that war, is only 90 miles away. And Pensacola in 1898 was doing a considerable amount of business with the interests down there, particularly in the shipment of lumber through the port of Pensacola. Now, the story of Cuba and the beginnings of the war takes us back actually about 400 years, because the island of Cuba had been discovered by the Colombian explorations. Cuba had been made a part of the Caribbean empire of the Spanish, and almost from the beginning, they began to develop sugar plantations, making a lot of money for people back home. This ultimately introduced slavery into black slavery into Cuba, and in time, a substantial number of Cubans, of Spanish, moved there and became citizens of Cuba. And this developed and evolved century after century, so that by the time we got into the mid-19th century, there was a sizable group of people who are of Spanish extraction, and these people were taking a lead from what had been happening throughout the 19th century in Latin America, where revolutions had one by one separated the countries in Central and South America from Spain itself. And now, by the time we get into the 1870s, a group of people we would call insurgents, I think today, had begun to revolt, asking the Spanish to leave. This led to violence. There was an outbreak of this in the mid-70s. That recommenced in the mid-1890s, when across the world we suffered a recession. That recession led to the lowering of sugar prices. That caused all kinds of problems in Cuba, and as a result, this violence broke out, and this now sooner or later was beginning to affect the sugar mills and the plantations, part of which were owned by Americans. And the American people back home here in the United States were very concerned, and they asked the president, first of all Mr. Cleveland, and then Mr. McKinley, to do something about it. Well, it continued to get worse, and the reports coming out of Cuba were very, very violent. The Spanish had sent a military leader by the name of Weyler into Cuba to try and suppress this violence. He did not succeed, and by the time we get into the year 1898, this was really getting out of hand. And as a result, our consul in Cuba, a man named Fitzhugh Lee, a Virginian, asked the president if he wouldn't send some naval presence to Havana to show the American flag, to try to protect the interests of our citizens there and the businesses. And they did. Late in January 1898, the battleship Maine was dispatched, and it made harbor in Havana. It was there for several days, in fact, long enough that they were planning to have a successor vessel come on board. And then in the second week of February, a terrible explosion rented the hull of the Maine, and it sank with a loss of about 280 lives. Well, as one can imagine, this caused a great stir across America. And at this time, we were just moving into the era of what some people later have called the Yellow Press, the work of William Randolph Hearst and some of the others, who blew these incidents up out of all context, and people began to say, now what should we be doing if they're sinking our ships over there? Of course, at that point there was no proof at all that the Spanish had been in any way involved with the explosion. Later studies think that maybe a mine caused it, but to this day I don't think anyone is really positive. But nonetheless, Americans were very concerned. The Navy Department established a court of inquiry. We sent the battleship Iowa into Havana Harbor to send divers down to examine what had happened. But what was happening, of course, was a press-inspired concern in the United States. And by the time we get into the 1st of March, men in the Congress were beginning to debate this thing, saying, well, if the Spanish can't put down the violence there, we've got problems with America. Maybe we ought to do something here in our country. And several of the congressmen and senators were urging the president to literally to go to war for us to put down the violence there. Well, this is the way things proceeded. Well, back in Spain, of course, the people there were very concerned. The last thing in the world they wanted was a war with the United States. Spain had gone through all sorts of difficulties within the 19th century, beginning with the Napoleonic Wars. There had been revolutions and riots and so forth, and several changes of the monarchy in there. And so by the time we get to 1898, the reigning monarch in Spain, in Madrid, was a 12-year-old boy, Alfonso XIII. And as a result, his mother, Maria Catharina, was actually the regent. And things were not going particularly well. The last thing they wanted to do was have a war with us. And so basically, step by step, the Spanish government tried to answer all of the criticisms that were coming out of Washington. And it seemed to some people that they had done so. But the violent group and the war hawks, if you will, in the Congress said, "We push on, Mr. President." And finally, on the 11th day of April, Mr. McKinley decided that should be done, and war was declared against the Spanish, with the intent, of course, of the Americans to take over, or not to take over, not to own, but to put down the violence and the problems that they were having in Cuba. Well, of course, as all of this has been going, we've had now almost 2 months in which this great concern had been festering across our country. And as a result of this, people were beginning to say, well, all right, how will we do this? What will we do? If we go to war, how are we going to arrange it? Because our own standing army was small. Now, our Navy, on the other hand, was quite large. It was growing, and as this particular time comes along, on February, March, April of 1898, the United States Navy and the Spanish Navy were almost the same in terms of numbers. However, our fleet was relatively new, was well trained, and we were disposed both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific, as were the Spanish. Spanish fleet was about the same size as ours, but it was old, it had not been modernized, and the training levels apparently were rather poor. So basically, as all this conversation went on, people were becoming more and more concerned. A young man who would later become our president, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, had a position as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he must have had great foresight, because as all of this conversation was going on and we had not yet reached the point of declaring war, Mr. Roosevelt, taking it on himself because the Secretary of the Navy was absent somewhere else, Mr. Roosevelt sent cables to Commodore George Dewey, who was in charge of the American fleet in the Pacific. He ordered Mr. Dewey, or the leader there, to be sure, keep your coal supply high, move the fleet closer to Manila, and just in case we do have war, we want to be prepared in advance. And that is exactly what Admiral Dewey did. Okay, while all this is going on, here in Pensacola, people were concerned. Now, here in the 21st century, it's hard to recognize how small the news coverage was that people were receiving on this event and any other. We did have 2 newspapers. They were very small. They came out. They were little 4-page affairs, and their coverage of national or international news was very small. The articles would be about that long. Some of the major news stories might be incorporated under one headline. It was a very poor coverage, and of course, this is long before the era of radio or television, and news magazines were very, very short in supply here. So basically, what people were getting here was small, but we did have a very interested commercial area within the community, because number one, we had a port. Number two, we had companies that were making lumber and naval stores, and these were items that could be sold and were being sold to the Caribbean countries. So as all of this begins to develop, war has been declared, and Pensacola itself, downtown, is a cosmopolitan town. We have to remember that by 1898, we had 4 railroads. We had an opera house. We had streetcars running up and down Palafox Street. We were in an era where many people in the community were making a lot of money, and people they liked a little aura of excitement, and consequently this story was bubbling up. I wish I could say it was something that the civic clubs discussed every week, but we can't say that because we didn't have any civic clubs to this point in time. This was something where discussion would have taken place in the Chamber of Commerce, places like that. But beyond that, people here were just on the sidelines, not worrying too much until war was declared. When the war was declared, then we suddenly got worried, because Basically, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Spanish, like we did, they had two fleets. People here weren't worried about the one in the Pacific, but they thought, well, if there's a Spanish fleet wandering around down here unopposed, what could happen to us here in the city? So almost at once, leaders in the community said to our congressmen and the Navy officials, let's ask for some appropriations from Washington to improve our defense at Fort Pickens and beyond that. And Commander Reniger, who was in charge of the Navy Yard at that time, was ordered to go on an accelerated program to be sure that everything at the yard was up to speed and what it should be. And Washington responded just like that. Quite a large sum of money came to Pensacola. And the first part of it was used to build an addition to Fort Pickens. And if one goes out and tours Fort Pickens today, that addition is still there right along the edge of the bay. And in that addition, they put new naval cannon, and then they re-drilled the old cannon that were there so that they would be more effective in case they were needed. So people here were very, very concerned about that. And one little holdover that we have that people could see today if they went out to visit Fort Pickens, in the course of improving the old fort itself, a welder was busy on the north side of the fort doing this thing just outside the wall. And as he was going, somehow or other, some of the liquid from his equipment began to leak toward the wall of the fort. What this poor man didn't know was that just inside that wall was approximately 1,000 pounds of powder left over from the Civil War. Well, by some misfortune, that flame from the fluid seeped through the wall, and there was a tremendous explosion. A big hole was blown in the wall. So the next time you go to Fort Pickens and you start to go in, recognize you don't go in through a door or portal, you go in through a large hole in the wall, and that's where it came from. Well, the next thing that our people here wanted to do, of course, is if we're going to have an invasion of Cuba, let's be sure that all the activity that goes through the port of Pensacola, let's make this the port of embarkation for an army if we do indeed invade. And of course, all our political strength was focused on Washington to try and make that happen, but that was one place where Pensacola did not succeed. The rest of the community here was cited upon two companies that we had in the community that had existed for almost one of them almost 40 years. These were what we would today call militia companies. They were affiliated with what we today call the Florida National Guard. They were each one of them was supported by outside sponsorship. These were men who felt that they were part of a military team. They came together at least once a month for drill, and it was their insistence that got the county to build an addition to the courthouse so these men would have an indoor place to drill in the wintertime. And that was when the county built what was called the annex to the courthouse, which then, of course, was at Palafox and Chase. So all of this is going together. We're moving out, and once war was declared, of course, Mr. Roosevelt's warning to Admiral or Commander Dewey was carried out, and Dewey's force moved into to Manila on May the 1st in the year 1898. The battle was very quick. Took only 3 to 4 hours. The Spanish fleet there had 10 vessels in it, but they were old, decrepit, and Admiral Dewey's force destroyed them. The Spanish lost about 300 men in the course of it. We had one fatality. This was an older oiler in one of the ships, a man who had hypertension. He died because of heat exhaustion. But that was our total main casualty, or the casualty that we suffered in Manila. So as we come to the end of 1898, we've now begun to put together the sinews of war. We've begun to arm ourselves. We've taken care of some of our local needs, and on the other side of the world, we've gone in and fired and won the battle, the naval battle of Manila. And as soon as the naval battle was completed there, Mr. Dewey quickly made arrangements for a small group to go ashore in Manila, and quickly cabled that he needed reinforcements. And in Washington, the Army appointed General Merritt to quickly begin bringing troops west, coming through as fast as railroads would take them, get them to San Francisco, and on the way to Manila to help put down any insurgency that might happen there. And that's where things stood at the end of the first track of our battle in the Spanish-American War.